propose to start with this event, so from the QUALICHeCK. So in my first presentation, I will give you the overall context of the QUALICHeCK project, and then also go in more detail about the overall philosophy regarding improved boundary conditions for a better quality of the work. My name is PWouters. I'm the manager of INEV EIG and also coordinator of the QUALICHeCK project. So the structure of the presentation is as follows. So first of all, introducing the QUALICHeCK project, its context, objectives, and what we expect to reach. Then, let's say, quality of the works, focus on the better skills, because there's also a lot of things happening in that area. And then, third part is quality of the works around the topic where control might be necessary and where a lot of the work of QUALICHeCK is focusing on. And then finally, some brief conclusions. So, to situate the context of the QUALICHeCK project, I take as a comparison a washing machine, where you know that energy efficiency for already many years, as for many other household appliances, is a common point of interest, where we have this labeling, where it is clear that you expect that if a machine has a label A, that indeed it meets the requirements of that label, and that if you have a machine of a label B, that it's less performing. So I think as customer, you expect a reliable label, but of course, because the first objective of a washing machine is not be energy efficient, but is to, let's say, clean the clothing, you of course expect a good quality. If you do it now for buildings, building like you see here, not the nicest architectural building, where now also the EPBD directive imposes that you have an energy certificate, it's clear that also there you expect that if you have a label A, that it is indeed corresponding with the specifications to get it, so you expect a reliable label, but of course, a building is more than energy efficiency. You first of all expect that it is a good quality. A good quality in terms of, let's say, issues like durability, or for example here where the concrete is damaged after a while. And if you think more about energy efficiency and renewable energies, that of course if you invest in for example, PV, that not after a heavy storm you have a damage as here in the picture. And so that is the overall context, and of course we work in a context where energy efficiency becomes more and more a driver and a quite stringent requirement. And you see here, for example, for the Flemish region in Belgium, how the maximum allowable energy level expressed in the Belgian context as E level is progressing as function of time. It started in 2006 with the level 100, and you see that in 2021, when the NZEP level has to be reached, the forecast is that it will be a requirement E30. So you see only 30% of what was allowed in 2006. But it means, of course, a lot of new technologies in terms of building cell, also in terms of technologies, and there, as new technologies give additional challenges for quality of the works, it is clear that the good quality of the work is essential to have the societal support for all these, let's say, requirements, but also, of course, in terms of societal cost, we don't want to have a lot of cost due to poor quality. And you see that the market uptake to these NZEP buildings goes quite well. Again, here the example for the Flemish region, where you see that already the building permits of 2014, about 20%, let's say, were meeting what in the Flemish region is defined as the NZEP in 2021. And so it's very important that all these, let's say, investments are done with a good quality of the works in mind, and that people are satisfied and that you have a long lifetime of the works, and also, of course, a good energy performance. So QUALICHeCK has two objectives. On the one hand, it is focusing on the reliability, the compliance of the EPC. And there, what we have done over the last 3 years, and we are now at the end of the project, is to set up a series of actions which should result in more attention and practical initiatives for actual compliance with the EPC, for new but also for innovative buildings, so create boundary conditions that people do what they declare, or that they declare what they have done and correctly. And then the second aspect, which is, let's say, closer to this webinar, is more or less similar, so a series of actions which should result in more attention and practical initiatives for achieving a better quality of the works, so create boundary conditions which stimulate and allow the building sector to deliver good quality of the works. Now, what aspects are we looking to in QUALICHeCK? That is, we have done a lot of work about the status on the ground, and you will hear later on more about it. Also about compliant and easily accessible EPC input data, which is not the topic of today, Then specific actions around quality of the works, ways to improve it, collecting good examples and guidance to do better, and also compliance frameworks, let's say identifying interesting compliance frameworks and guidance to come to effective compliance frameworks for EPC-related issues, but important for this webinar, for quality of the works related issues. In these 3 years, we have looked to a lot of technologies, but with a specific focus on these 4 areas, so transmission characteristics, ventilation and air tightness, sustainable summer comfort techniques, and renewables in multi-energy systems. And we had also participants in 9 countries, and these countries were selected to a large extent with, let's say, the idea to have a good coverage of what you might find in Europe. So we have big countries like Spain and France, very small countries like Cyprus. We have countries with a severe climate, like for example Sweden, very hot climate like Greece, Spain and Cyprus. Countries which are quite well advanced with respect to EPC compliance, other countries with already a good track record with respect to quality of the work. So that hopefully from the lessons learned we have, I think, something which is relevant for most EU countries. With respect to the outcomes, the deliverables is basically around 3 areas, so about the status on the ground, about interesting approaches, and about guidance for improvements. But I will come back at the end of the webinar with a brief overview of all the deliverables of this QUALICheCK project. So let's move then to the second part, quality of the works. This is somewhat outside, let's say, of the focus of QUALICheCK, in the sense that QUALICheCK has not worked a lot itself on actions to directly come to better skills of the work, but we think it's, let's say, there are several aspects in this paragraph or in this part. I try a little bit to show the context of it. And I use here a number of slides which were presented yesterday, because yesterday we had a meeting of the QUALICheCK platform. So slides which were presented yesterday by Horia Petran from Romania, who is heavily involved in a number of EU initiatives focusing on, let's say, skills initiatives. And I think it's good to also briefly mention it here, and afterwards then to show where QUALICheCK is, let's say, complementary with what we are discussing in the context of the construction skills initiatives. This slide is from a day earlier, from Tuesday, when we had our 4th QUALICheCK conference, and where there was interactive voting with the audience. And so the question was asked to the audience, what do you consider as effective ways for improving the quality of the works, like improved education, training of the workforce, less requirements regarding quality checks by public administrations, planning details in English, video surveillance of the construction site, higher penalties in case of low quality. And you see, so the highest score went to improved education, training of the workforce. And so yesterday, Horia Petran so made a comparison with what Lenin said in the past. So a long time ago, trust is good, but control is better. Meaning that you have to have third party, or let's say external control important, but there is also another approach where you more count on, let's say, good quality competence of the workers, where the principle is more control is good. But if you can create boundaries, conditions that you can trust the people because they are competent, motivated, and so on, of course, trust is cheaper. Then in that case, then control is good. I think there are 2 approaches which each have their advantages and disadvantages. In the framework of the next few slides, the focus is on the first one. So trust is good, but control is better. Control is good, but trust is cheaper. So meaning that if you can create the boundary conditions that those who have to do the job are competent, and at the same time able to apply it and willing to apply it in practice, of course, that's a very good condition. And I think that's one of the key areas where this initiative focus on. It started with built-up skills a number of years ago, where the idea was to see the workforce on the ground, and how can we take actions to improve the competence of the workforce. And so this was, in practice, there were what's called 2 pillars. So pillar 1 was, let's say, involving all EU countries and resulted in national qualification platforms and roadmaps, whereby the idea was at national level with the major stakeholders identify how can we come in a structured way to better education, better boundary conditions that the building workforce with respect to energy efficiency, renewable energies, is, let's say, becoming more competent so that you can come to good delivery of the work. These reports you find on the Built Up Skills website will be integrated also in Built Up. And then we had Pillar 2 with a more limited number of countries. That was a call for proposals where a number of projects passed, which is still running. So you see that at the bottom. So for Built Up Pillar 1, there were in total 30 reports, and for Pillar 2, there were, let's say, 22 initiatives which have been running. This is now followed up by, in the framework of Horizon 2020, of what now is called construction skills, with the first call in 2014, and you see there the projects which have been passed. And there has also been a call in 2016 where now a number of projects are, let's say, I think in the negotiation phase or close to finalization. And so all these projects, the time is lacking here to go into detail, but all these projects, let's say, are focusing on, let's say, initiatives to come to better quality of the works, implicitly assuming that afterwards this knowledge will be applied and result in better, let's say, quality on the work site. Here's just one example of a project run in the Netherlands, Built Up Skills, let's say, advisory app, where you, let's say, count a lot on, let's say, the smartphone to develop applications, and so which I think is one of the innovative ways to bring better quality on the work site. So that's one approach, so where you, and I think a very important approach, where you say, okay, in general, but in particular of the fact that there are new energy-related technologies coming into the work environment, it is important that in a structured way you try to bring more competence as well at the design level, construction site level, and so overall that the quality of the work can improve. As I said from a few slides ago, so as Lenin said, trust is good, but control is better. In case there are concerns that it is not sufficient to, let's say, count on the trust, so that you assume that the workforce will do it correctly, it might be necessary to have, let's say, some kind of control in order to check that indeed what has to be done is done, or what has to be declared is correctly, let's say, correctly reported. And that's the third part in the presentation. So quality of the works, where, and that's also where I think QUALICHeCK has been working a lot on, where there is, let's say, attention to this control dimension. So setting up pragmatic, efficient frameworks to guarantee that there is a high probability that quality of the works is effectively achieved. And quality, let's say, control can be done in different ways. Of course, the building owner himself can control, check on site, do I get what I have to obtain? The architect, other persons. I think it's a very direct way, and so if the quality is there and the competence, I think it's a very efficient way. But as you can imagine, there is not always the required competence, in particular for more new technologies, and sometimes also a conflict of interest in the sense that it might be that for some partners, they want to reduce the cost, and so in that sense that minimizing the cost might be in contradiction with requiring the required quality. And so there are other possibilities, and there we have with QUALICHeCK tried to identify interesting examples. That's with third parties, where, for example, you can focus on the control of competence of designer or executor, so that you say, I want to have a guarantee that this person, this company, has the required competence, and then expecting that in practice it will be effectively used. But you can also go a step further, or a different way, saying that, okay, I'm going really on the site itself and look if the execution of the works is done according the principles. So where you more check, okay, is all the things done, for example, the various components installed correctly, or you can directly control the achieved performances. Take, for example, a ventilation system, where you have specifications that you say, okay, I go on site and I'm not checking if the design and so is well done, but I check the performances, whether it's an airflow rate, whether it's an acoustical performances, so you measure the performances in practice. And so it's clear that if you can avoid third-party control because other ways are effective, I think it's not necessary to disable, because it clearly induces a cost. If there is evidence that without a third-party control, it is not evident to come to the expected quality, it might be the best way to go forward. So in the next few slides, I will try to illustrate is that you have to really analyze case by case. Is it sufficient, or first of all, is it necessary to invest in capacity building? Is it sufficient, or do you have to combine it with enforcement schemes, or is it sufficient only to have enforcement schemes? And so this is illustrated in the next slides a little bit step by step. So we are now in a context that, let's say, for new buildings, but more and more also for innovative buildings, we are confronted with the cost-optimal requirements and the NZEP requirements. This clearly, for a number of areas, let's say, results in the need for more and/or improved training. It's clear that some technologies applied for years, for example, take insulation of a cavity wall with the present requirements, represent some other challenges. So you have to analyze if there is a need for training and/or improved training, and then, let's say, set it up as a new option of training or upgrading the existing training. This is fully, I would say, in the context of built-up skills and related activities, and also, of course, looking to what are the new technologies like the smartphone and the tablet and so on. Then I think, assuming that you are sure that the environment is there so that people can acquire the required competence, I think the next question is it sufficient to count on this competence that the market itself will do it, or do you have to check in practice that the competence is there? I take, for example, the example of the ventilation system or a PV system. Do the people, let's say the workers, will effectively follow this training, or do you need some external push that indeed they do the training, they follow the training, that whether or not they pass an exam, so that you are sure the competence is on the market? If you take, for example, the area of renewables, so there, as you might know, so there is the requirement in the RES directive that member states must set up a framework for the certification of installers, which means in practice so that you set up a whole environment which at the end allows to certify an installer, which in principle means there is trust in the market that this installer has the required competence. And so that's the, I would say typically this part of the scheme is typically the area of built-up skills, construction skills. So let's say create the boundary conditions that you can have trust that there is the competence in the market. Now, this might be sufficient, but there may be cases where you need to go further. So do you need to check in practice if the works are correctly done? Because you can imagine situations where the competence is there, but because of commercial reasons or other reasons that the knowledge is not applied in practice. And so I think that's important to analyze technology by technology. Is it sufficient to guarantee the competence is there, or do you really have also to do some kind of checks on site to be sure that the work is effectively correctly done? If it is not needed, so if you have sufficient guarantee and if the competence is there, then I think you have a high probability of good workmanship. And an example here, for example, at the left-hand side, the concrete, where you see corrosion of the metal weaponing. I think if a contractor or a person on site knows what he has to do to avoid this, I think it's sufficient, because if there is the competence there, and also that they understand if I make this kind of errors, this clearly will result in damage and it clearly will involve liabilities of the contractor, I think there is a high probability that this work will be done correctly. Example on the right-hand side, where you see an existing beam is reinforced with let's say, a steel to have, let's say, a higher performance. I think that on the one hand, it can be sufficient to be sure that the competence is in the market, because people understand it has to do with stability, so really health-threatening risks. So you could say that's sufficient. Of course, if you think about the consumer, you might say, okay, but as it is so vital for, let's say, the operation of the building and the risk of accidents, you might decide, okay, even if we count on that the contractors will do it correctly, that you think of a third-party control to be absolutely sure that there is a small risk. So you have to, I think it's an example to show you have to assess to what extent is it worldwide necessary to consider a third-party control. I think a good example is also thermal bridges. As you know, thermal bridges has potentially two problems. That is a higher heat loss, what you see on the left-hand side with this infrared image, and on the right-hand side, so condensation and mold growth. Assume that you train as well designers and the contractors for both aspects. My feeling is that for the right-hand side, risk of condensation and mold, that, let's say, people who are, let's say, well, you understand the thing, will, I think, do the necessary things to avoid condensation or mold, because in case of problems, it's clear that in case of a court case, they might be held liable. On the other hand, for the increased heat losses, the left-hand side, in practice, this is not evident to assess and to really give damage where they might be responsible. So for the left-hand side, there it's more important to find, let's say, robust frameworks that people are really motivated to do the work correctly. And we have collected in the framework of QUALICHeCK interesting examples in a number of countries as listed here on the scheme. And so take this example of thermal bridges. So assume that you are an architect or a contractor. First of all, of course, you have to understand what's a thermal bridge, so to understand the conditions, so it requires a certain effort. You have probably to follow training, whether it's for better building design or assessing the thermal bridge. And so typically, to avoid the thermal bridge, it might, let's say, require a somewhat more complex design, somewhat more cost in terms of, let's say, material and care for execution. And so if you then, at the end, have done your work, you still have to assess, it's not testing, but it's calculating the thermal bridge, which will still have a certain extra loss compared with a one-dimensional calculation. So you see it requires a lot of efforts, all of them involving cost. And if you do your work correctly, but your colleague competitor says, I don't mind at all, and I fill in at the end that there are no thermal bridges, of course, then you are economically in a very bad situation. And so, whereas I think for condensation and mold, I think training is probably the most important thing to keep the problem under control. For energy loss, it's clear that there a third-party involvement by government or others is probably quite important. And so you have really to see case by case to what extent is there a risk that without a third-party control, whether it's about the persons itself, the competence, or the work on site, you will come to acceptable conditions or not. And so what we did in QUALICHeCK, and you will hear in the next presentations more about the kind of information we collected, is, let's say, look to some of these examples and to document it, to guide it to the reader or the user to come to better quality of the works. So I come to the conclusions of this first presentation. So it's clear that the move towards NZEP buildings requires often new technologies with challenges in terms of quality of the works. And so it clearly requires extra efforts in terms of training, competence, let's say competence of the designers and the workers on site. Secondly, so better skills of the workforce is important. Investing in training and support is essential. It is clearly essential. And thirdly, so as I have tried to illustrate, quality frameworks with a third-party control are sometimes necessary to guarantee that the required quality is reached. It's surely not something that you say by definition you have to consider third-party control, but based on the risk assessment and cost-benefit assessment, there are clearly cases where a quality framework with a third-party control is very, very relevant. So that was what I wanted to present to you in this first presentation. I thank you for your attention. In case there are questions, I'm happy to reply.